fellow Trek Chatters, I'm Pit Truckee, and welcome to another episode of Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. Happy Halloween, everybody, and welcome to the Halloween episode for 2022 of Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. What I want to talk about in today's episode are some of the scariest moments in all of the Star Trek franchise, which we all know at this point is pretty massive. So I went through all of the different episodes of all the different series. I even looked at one of the movies that I'm going to possibly discuss here. And what I did was come up with the 10 most freakish and ghoulish moments in the entire Star Trek franchise. So I'm going to do 10 episodes from all of the different series. And then after the credits, I'm going to do a little follow-up where I'm going to talk about one of the movies in the Star Trek franchise that had some of the grossest, scariest moments in the franchise. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start with my list of the 10 freakish and most grotesque episodes of Star Trek. So coming in at number 10 would be from Voyager Season 1, the episode Faces. This is the episode where B'Elanna Torres was split into two people, a fully human B'Elanna and a fully Klingon B'Elanna. So obviously that's kind of spooky in itself. The makeup itself wasn't spooky, but I mean just the thought of being two different people and being split into two physically unique people. I mean that's a pretty scary thought of that happening with anybody, you know. But what I really thought was kind of ghoulish about this episode was the Vidian himself. First of all, the Vidian makeup was pretty spooky to begin with, because basically we know that the Vidians were suffering from the phage, and what it was doing was destroying their tissues. And so what they would do is they would harvest skin and organs from other life forms and graft it onto their bodies, or implant the organs into their own bodies to fight the phage. And they looked grotesque. They just looked mutated, and like skin was rotting, and at different parts it didn't even look. Obviously, it came from different species, so it looked mixed, matched, and just hodgepodge. It was horrible, you know. And so the Vidian, who actually was the scientist responsible for splitting Torres into two, he actually was in love with Torres during the episode. It was very obvious, and he felt that B'Elanna saw him as grotesque. So he thought maybe B'Elanna would love him, the Klingon version of B'Elanna would love him if he actually had a new face. So some of the Voyager crew members were put into slave work in the caves in around where their facility was. And there was a character there named Durst. And apparently off-screen, this Vidian killed Durst, skinned him of his face, and actually put Durst's face onto himself. And obviously B'Elanna knew who it was, and it was gross. I mean, because you had the Vidian gross skin on the back, but you had this face that was glued basically and melded onto his face, and he had the trickle of blood coming down his mouth. Which was really interesting about the episode is that the guy who played Durst actually played Durst and that Vidian character, which made sense. Obviously, it made it look like, you know, obviously the face matched, you know, but I mean, it was just gross. The fact that they ripped his face off, he grafted it onto his own face, the blood trickling. I mean, it was just a pretty nasty looking episode all the way around, you know. So, yeah, it was very interesting, it was very entertaining, but I mean, it had its moments of stomach turning moments in the episode, let's just put it that way. All right. Going into the number 9 most freakish and grotesque episode of Star Trek was, and this one might seem kind of odd, but Voyager Season 2, Threshold. Now obviously Voyager's Threshold episode is not known for necessarily being grotesque, as it is more about Tom and Captain Janeway becoming these salamander creatures, which they were supposed to have evolved, and they ended up breeding and having babies, which were left behind on a planet in the Delta Quadrant. But if you think about it, there are some pretty grotesque moments in the episode. As soon as Tom Paris starts mutating and evolving into what humans were going to become millennia down the road, it starts out very minimal. You see these little veins starting to kind of pop out around his temples, like these grayish blue veins. And as time, they spread down his cheeks. And as the episode progresses, his skin starts turning like a yellowish kind of color. and it looks like his skin is peeling off of his head. And what ends up happening at one point is Tom's talking to, it was either, I believe, Kess and the doctor maybe, and he had a hard time talking. All of a sudden he starts coughing, and something seems to come loose inside his mouth, and he yanks, and he ends up pulling out his own tongue. And he looks over at Kess looks grossed about the whole thing, and he looks at them, and he actually starts laughing, which is just creepy in itself, that he would think that that was funny. You would think that that would actually freak you out if you lost your tongue. Any of you ever had those dreams where you feel like your teeth are becoming brittle and breaking out? I know I've had those plenty of times, and those dreams freak me out. So the thought of my teeth coming out, certainly if it actually happened in real life, wouldn't actually make me laugh if people saw it. You know, but can you imagine your own tongue, ripping your own tongue out and thinking it was funny? You know, it just, the makeup that they did for that episode, especially in those moments where he was mutating, was just creepy, and it was wonderful. They did a really nice job in that episode. Eventually, as the episode went on, he mutated into what looked like some fish-like kind of salamander-like creature, you know, which looked like your typical run-of-the-mill Star Trek makeup job for an alien of the week. But during those parts in sickbay, it was pretty grotesque. All right. Going on to the number 8 most freakish and grotesque episode of Star Trek, I was going to go into TNG, 7th season, the episode Genesis. So this was the episode where Barclay ended up having some sort of flu, and Dr. Crusher gave him some sort of something to fight the flu. Well, what it ended up doing was mutating the flu, and it became a syndrome where the crew actually de-evolved into different species from their homeworlds. All right, it became known as Barclay protomorphosis syndrome. So there were definitely some grotesque moments. We didn't see like a lot of blood, a lot of gore, things like that. But we saw some interesting, kind of scary-looking makeup jobs. For example, if you look at Counselor Troy, she's not super scary, but you see her with the gills on the side and the kind of amphibian-looking eyes, and she has like the knobbed fingers and the webbed fingers, kind of like the flipper kind of thing going on, like you would see on like different frogs, things like that. So that was kind of weird looking. You saw her kind of up and out, being pulled out of the tub, and she was kind of like grasping for air, it looked like a little bit. So it was kind of a scary scene. The next one that got a little bit more grotesque was when Picard and Data went into engineering, and Barclay just kind of came out of nowhere as a spider with all these weird looking, like, multiple eyes on one side of his face, and he was banging his arms against the glass near the warp core, and it looked like he had claws on his hands. His tongue was kind of going everywhere. He was banging him, and then he just scurried off, you know. And then seeing Picard's reaction to that, that was pretty scary and got your heart racing to some degree. Again, the spider makeup wasn't overly over-the-top scary, but it was enough that it was enough to get a scare reaction out of people. And then obviously we had Worf de-evolve. He was the first of the crew that seemed to de-evolve, and he turned into this proto-Klingon. So you've got like this exoskeleton with, you know, the supracranial ridges. He's got these weird looking teeth kind of protruding out of his mouth. And obviously he seemed a lot grander in size, and he's running around the corridors like this, you know, those kind of things. And he had this big like spinal cord sticking out of his back, out of his skin. You know, so that was a pretty scary thing, watching Worf running around the corridors. But I'll be honest with you, that was not the scariest Worf moment for me in that episode. The scariest Worf moment was in sickbay when Worf was being examined by Dr. Crusher, and she found these sacs along his neck, and she very quietly says, "Worf, open your mouth." And there's this pause, which kind of reminds me of in the Rocky Horror Picture Show when Frankenfurter's singing Sweet Transvestite, and he says, "I see you shudder with anticipation." That's kind of like that Frankenfurter moment in that episode, because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you don't know what's going to happen. All of a sudden, Worf kind of hisses and opens his mouth, and all this venom comes shooting out into Dr. Crusher's face. You know, that is just even to this day, it's been how many years since that episode? 28 years? That moment is the freakiest moment of the episode for me. I don't even like to watch it. I usually turn away from it because it's even the way the Worf's mouth looks when he goes, it's just freaky, you know. So that episode, even though it wasn't meant to necessarily be a horror episode, had its definite scary moments with the makeup and the fact that you didn't know what was going to come jumping out or what. So it was a pretty cool episode. All right, number 7 in my list of freakish and grotesque episodes of Star Trek was from Enterprise Season 3, the episode Impulse. All right, so this was the episode, we learned in the second season finale, The Expanse, that there was a Vulcan ship that went into the Delphic Expanse and got lost. And they showed a video at Starfleet headquarters to Archer of the crew of that Vulcan ship going crazy. And we didn't really know anything much about it. But what we ended up finding out in this episode was they found the ship, the Saleya, in I can't remember, was it Trillium D was the name of that ore that was all through the Delphic Expanse that kind of helped with the different weird things that happened in that area. Well, anyway, that obviously we knew throughout the season that had an effect on Vulcans because T'Pol was injecting it into her body, and it was ending up causing her to not be able to handle her emotions. All right, and or suppress them. So, but what we found they were in this Trillium D asteroid ore field. And what it did was it basically made the crew go crazy. And what it did was it turned them basically into Vulcan zombies. And so, you know, it was kind of like an episode of The Walking Dead in Star Trek, basically. And the Vulcan zombies are walking around the corridors, doing crazy things, chasing the crew. You didn't know when they were going to pop out. You saw they had like these kind of marks or burns or lesions on their skin. And at one point they have one of the Vulcan zombies in sickbay, and he closes his mouth and he screams, "Ah!" And his teeth are all like brown and yellow and all of that. I mean, it's just a scary zombie episode. You didn't know when they were going to come popping in and out. So it was a nice little Halloween kind of episode for Enterprise. Scary in its own way, grotesque makeup, pretty neat episode. Number 6 in the most freakish and grotesque episodes of Star Trek is from Deep Space Nine, Season 5, probably around mid-season, The Darkness and the Light. And if many of you don't remember this episode, this is where 5 of Kira's friends, who were either in the Shakaar resistance movement or they helped out the Shakaar resistance movement, were being killed one by one by one. So there were 5 specific people. The first was Vedic Latha. He was in the Resistance as a fighter. He ended up being killed by a hunter probe that was built into a candle in a religious ceremony in a cave on Bajor, and he got shot by that. After he died, then you had somebody named Trenton Fala, who was a lady who worked as a cleaner at a Cardassian records office, but she would pass on information to the Shakaar resistance cell. She ended up, she was scared for her life, so Kira sent Worf and Dax in a runabout to go and pick her up to keep her safe. When they transported her on board a runabout, she had what was called I have it written here, a remat detonator, which basically scrambled her pattern during transport and caused her to transport aboard, but she was all deformed and burned. Then we find out that there was another Shakaar resistance member named Mubara who was killed somewhere, I believe on Bajor, from a micro-explosive. They didn't really go in the episode too much into him. He just kind of randomly, Kira just found out about him in Odo's office. And then her friends from 2 seasons earlier, Pharrell and Lupiza, come because they know something's going on. They're being hunted down. They wanted to make sure Kira was okay. She stayed with Kira in the O'Brien's quarters, but we find out that there's an explosion in the O'Brien's quarters where Pharrell and Lupiza were killed, and it was caused by a hunter probe that was attached to some freighter that found Pharrell and Lupiza attached to the window and exploded, killing them instantly. So obviously Kira's going crazy by all of these people dying, and she's also being taunted by every time there's a death, there's a message that is found by her. It says, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3. And it turned out that it was her voice just garbled to be disguised. So she ends up finding out who is responsible for this, and she goes by runabout to this planet in the demilitarized zone, somewhere around that area, and she finds a Cardassian named Solaran Prin, and he's stalking around talking about how he's the light and she's the darkness, and we see him with a big burn on like half of it, the right half of his face. And what we find out is that he worked in the home and did laundry for a Cardassian named Gul Pirak, who was responsible for, he executed 15 Bajorans during the occupation for not displaying the Cardassian banner outside of their houses. So the Shakar resistance cell retaliated and killed Gul Pirak and his family, but Solaran Prin was maimed in the ensuing chaos. And so he was seeking revenge against Kira and the resistance. And so he killed all of Kira's friends, and then he was going to kill her, and he was going to surgically remove the O'Brien's baby from her. But Kira ended up being able to get the upper hand on him and killed him. So, I mean, it's just freaky, all of these people dying. You didn't know who was going to die, how they were going to die, when the Kira was going to get the message. And then, you know, he's skulking around in the dark in his home, and he's got this big burn on his face. It's just grotesque looking. So, you know, just it was a good, spooky, whodunit kind of episode. It was very enjoyable. Going on to the number 5 most freakish and grotesque episode in the Star Trek franchise. We're going to stay in Season 5 of Deep Space Nine, but we're going to go toward the end of the season to Empok Nor. So this was the episode where they needed some supplies for Deep Space Nine, some parts, and they talk about going to the space station Trillina system, Empok Nor. And so O'Brien and some Starfleet engineers and Nog go, but Garrick goes along with them because they know that Cardassians tend to booby-trap places that they abandon. So Garrick manages to get them on board. When they activate the station, there are 3 Cardassian stasis pods in Empok Nor's infirmary, and 2 of them wake up. One of them we find is actually dead. Well, Garrick is able to identify who they are. They belong to the 3rd Battalion of the First Order. And when they scan these Cardassians, they find that they have a high level of psychotropic medications that enhance the natural xenophobic tendencies of the Cardassians. So these 2 Cardassians out of the 3 who survived from the 3rd Battalion start stalking the crew and kill 3 or 4 of the different crew members. Well, at one point, we start noticing Garrick is starting to get a little bit paranoid, and he becomes overly focused on the fact that O'Brien had killed Cardassians during the Cardassian War with the Federation, and that he was on Setlik 3. And everybody was kind of like, why does he keep bringing this up? Well, eventually, Garrick saves the life of one of the Starfleet engineers, or crew members, who was on board. I think maybe he had been a security officer. Garrick had already killed one of the Cardassians before that, and he kills that second one, and when that officer thanks Garrick, Garrick ends up killing him. And so, because Garrick is becoming more and more upset and paranoid toward O'Brien, he ends up kidnapping Nog and playing like a cat and mouse game with him. And at one point in the episode, what's really freaky is Garrick actually hangs or displays all the bodies of the Starfleet officers who went with him who had died on the promenade on Empok Nor, which O'Brien finds. Eventually, Garrick and O'Brien end up getting into it, but O'Brien is able to stop Garrick and knock him out, and save Nog and take him back to Deep Space Nine. And obviously Garrick was returned to normal, and he felt very sad about what had happened. But it's a very dark, mysterious episode. You don't know when the Cardassians are going to pop out and where and how they're going to kill the people. You know, that they know that they're going to be dying. The Boolean character in particular was very scared and freaked out about the situation. And obviously it had threads that led into early on in Season 6 into Rocks and Shoals, because Garrick and Nog were on that Jem'Hadar ship together, and when they crash landed, Garrick and Nog were walking together on the shoreline on the beach, and Garrick noticed that Nog wouldn't turn his back on him, and Nog said, I will not turn my back on you again. Even though there were extenuating circumstances that Garrick brought up, Nog said he would never trust him again. So that was a very dark episode, which was very enjoyable, but also very scary and grotesque. So now we're going to go on to number 4 episode of the most freakish and grotesque episode in Star Trek. And I'm going to go on to TNG Season 6, the episode Schisms. So this is the episode where Riker was waking up very tired. He didn't understand what was going on. He started becoming paranoid. Dr. Crusher at one point was scanning him with a medical tricorder, and he gets her tricorder out of the way and says, "Do you have to really be that close to me?" And then at one point, Worf is getting his hair trimmed by Mr. Mott, and he has a pair of scissors that get too close to Worf's head, and Worf kind of grabs his wrist and is kind of paranoid about that as well. We find out several other crew members from the Enterprise are having the same problems, so Counselor Troy gets them together, and this is a pretty freaky part of the episode where they're using their memories as best they can to piece together what they have seen. And they build this table with what looks like a surgical table with all these surgical scissors and cutters and lasers. And you hear this different clicking kind of noise that they heard in the background. And at one point, Geordi goes, "We've all been in this room before," or something to that effect. You know, so that's pretty scary at that part of the episode. It's like, what the heck is going on here? Why are we all having this shared experience? Well, we end up finding out that there's some sort of life form that's taking the Enterprise crew members. They belong to some sort of subspatial domain. And so they create a little pocket of our universe in theirs so they can actually experiment and study our crew members on board the Enterprise. Riker ends up getting himself hooked up with some sort of device or whatever so that they know on the Enterprise when he leaves. He ends up finding out what's going on. Ensign Rager is there. He ends up rescuing her. But there are these hooded creatures that you see in the dark. And you can see they have like little beaks, something to that effect, maybe scaly kind of stuff. You don't see them really fully, which I think is part of the mystery to keep them scary. But they end up escaping. But the real chilling part of the episode is really at the end. Nobody really knows what the motives of these aliens were. Were they really just experimenting on the crew? I mean, at one point they say in the episode, Riker's arm had obviously been surgically removed and then surgically reattached. You know, so, but they don't know exactly what the whole motive was. Were they going to eventually kill them, or were they going to experiment on them even more? What was the whole purpose? So the whole episode, even, you had the scary moments in it, but at the same time, you never knew the true intentions of the kidnappers, this race. You know, and to this day, you know, almost 30 years later, they never explained that in a future episode. Moving on to the number 3 most freakish and grotesque episode in the Star Trek franchise is from Strange New Worlds Season 1. And I am going to go and talk about the Aliens, Alien 3 Predator ripoff episode, All Those Who Wander. So this is the episode where the Enterprise receives a distress call from the USS Peregrine. They crash land on some dark, snowy planet. The Enterprise goes off on some other mission, I think up to K7 to drop off supplies. 2 shuttles with Pike and several of the Enterprise crew members go down and they find the ship. They go on board the ship, they find this girl, Newt. I don't know what the other character's name is, but it's basically the Newt character in this episode. They also find an alien who is protecting this girl. They're very close. This alien starts having like these convulsions, and he starts leaking this yellowy fluid from his chest, and a couple creatures come bursting out of him, obviously killing him, and we find out that they're Gorn babies. And so they go running off into the ship, and the crew's trying to find where they're at. So, I mean, obviously you have your grotesque moments. I mean, you see this fluid coming out of this guy, and then there's blood. And then it's not even just him, but, you know, you do see the creatures bursting out of him in I think it was 2 places, or maybe 4. But we also see dead crew members from the USS Peregrine outside of the ship, dead laying in the snow, and you see blood on rocks and and in the snow. Pretty grotesque. At one point, Hemmer is actually sprayed by the venom of one of the little Gorn babies that's running around the ship, and they're growing rapidly. And we find out later in the episode that that's how the Gorn reproduce. So Hemmer had a couple Gorn babies inside of him, and he decides to sacrifice himself rather than these things being born. So you have our Ripley moment, where he actually goes backwards and flings himself off a cliff to his death, even though they don't show it as up close as they did with Ripley going into the furnace in Alien 3. But I mean, it's a pretty scary episode, considering it being a ripoff. It is pretty grotesque. I just finished watching it last night, just to kind of refresh my memory of it. I mean, there's blood all over the ship, smeared everywhere. At one point, you see a handprint on the wall. You know, you see these baby creatures blowing out of this guy's body. You see the little girl scared. You see Nurse Chapel screaming and scared for her life. She goes in and manages to get a force field around her to protect herself for a period of time. You don't know when these Gorn are going to come popping out. They grow super fast. Spock goes all Zachary Quinto Spock and starts channeling his anger and starts freaking out, screaming all over the ship, you know, trying to entice them to capture them. At one point, they actually freeze one of the Gorn babies, and after Lon comes out of a protection, like some sort of container that she was in, she smashes it because of the anger she has about being in a Gorn colony when she was little. You know, so a lot of gross stuff. As a matter of fact, I was trying to look for pictures of the grotesque stuff, you know, on different websites. Trek Core, Trek Movie, Memory Alpha, a whole bunch of other different places, and even StarTrek.com, and I had no luck. So I guess a lot of people don't really want to keep these pictures, you know, for people to see. So really, you're just going to have to kind of watch the episode again to kind of pick out all the grotesque moments. But, I mean, apart from it being a blatant ripoff of other sci-fi movies, it was a pretty grotesque episode, and I felt that it needed to be mentioned in my list. Staying in the new Trek era, we're going to go to number 2 episode of the Freakish and Grotesque episodes of Star Trek. We're going to go into Picard Season 1, the first season episode, Stardust City Rag. All right, and this is the episode where the crew go and try to find Bruce Maddox on, I think it's Free Cloud, the name was of the planet. But the episode starts with a flashback to 7 years earlier. 7 of 9 is coming after to save Icheb. And we see Icheb is being tortured by a woman named Bajazel, or as 7 of 9 refers to her as Jay. And you can see his one implant here, his upside-down L-shaped implant has been ripped out, and they have a drill, and they're literally drilling out his eyeball, his cybernetic eyeball, and you see it in the episode literally being pulled out of his body. It's got to be one of the most grotesque, disgusting moments in all Star Trek, and obviously it makes it harder because as those of us who watched Icheb on Voyager, you know, watching his character being tortured, that's very hard to see. And there's blood on the sheets next to him. 7 of 9 eventually fights her way to Icheb, and Icheb tells her to leave, but that's basically her son. And so she decides, instead of just leaving him there to die a grotesque death, after she hugs him and cries, she euthanizes him. She shoots him. All right? Later on in the episode, we obviously know that 7 of 9 wants revenge against Bajazel, and she ends up getting her wish. They're bantering back and forth about what happened with Icheb and why Icheb was so important to her. By the way, as a side note, it turns out, we find out in season 1 of Picard that there is a black market for Borg parts, Borg components, which is why she wanted to kill Icheb anyway. But she tortured Icheb. She gave him no anesthetics to deal with the removal of these implants, and she seemed to enjoy it while it was happening, while he was screaming in agony. So this is the reason why 7 of 9 finally blew Bajazel away, literally. Since that's something you've never seen 7 of 9 do before. So that makes the episode even darker, beyond just the death of Icheb. Seeing what 7 of 9 has started becoming. But, I mean, a lot of times that's what happens. That's part of the human condition. And when somebody takes away somebody or severely harms somebody that we love, sometimes we do dark and crazy things to get revenge or for the situation, you know. So it was a pretty dark episode, but it was very grotesque, you know. And fans to this day still talk about the whole Icheb, you know, eyeball being ripped out. It's a very controversial moment among Star Trek. All right, so what we're going to do now is talk about the number 1 freakish and grotesque episode in all of the Star Trek franchise. And in my opinion, that has to be going all the way back to The Next Generation, Season 1, Conspiracy. Who doesn't remember that episode and the kind of scary moments that one had? So the episode was pretty scary and dark from the beginning about this possible Federation conspiracy that's being figured out by the Enterprise crew. They go back to Earth. And obviously we know that Admiral Quinn comes on board, and at one point he's attacking Riker. He's got super strength, all that fun stuff. And Dr. Crusher finds this little thing protruding from Quinn's neck. They don't know what it is. But anyway, Picard is down at Starfleet headquarters with a bunch of admirals. He's invited to dinner, and this is where the gory stuff really starts. So you have Captain Scott and a couple of some admirals in the dining hall with Picard. They open up their food, and it's a bunch of live, disgusting worms. And you actually see the actors like putting their hands in these worms, and obviously they're not eating them. They do different camera angles or whatever, but it gives the impression that they're eating these live worms that's in the food, and they think Picard is one of them, infected with one of these parasites. So eventually Riker comes down and pretends that he's actually infected as well, and as soon as he gets ready to start eating the worms, he starts phasering the admirals. Captain Scott gets fired on, and at one point this little bug-like creature comes crawling out of Captain Scott's mouth, and it goes running. Or I'm sorry, not Captain Scott's mouth. They catch one of the admirals running in the hallway, and they phaser him. The little creature comes out of his mouth, okay, and it goes underneath a door. And Picard and Riker obviously go into that room, and they see Remick is working some sort of control panel, making weird noises. And he's in a chair. He turns around. There's this little creature running toward him, and Picard and Riker try to warn him, and Remick's kind of like, he's just kind of like, who cares? And the creature comes in, and very disgustingly, Remick actually eats that baby creature and swallows it, and you can see his neck is starting to throb. And this is the point where Remick is definitely infected, and he starts talking about they want peaceful coexistence and things like that. So Picard and Riker just say the heck with this, so they phaser Remick. And what they do is they actually, not only do they phaser him back into his seat, but for some reason they decide to blow his head off. So that's probably the goriest part of the episode, is literally they show the flesh melt off his face, and then his head literally explodes. It's disgusting. It looks like meatloaf going around the room. But that's not where the grossness ends. Alright, so the head explodes, head meat get to flying around the room, and then all of a sudden what ends up happening is his abdomen starts to dissolve, his uniform, his abdomen, everything, and then you see something starting to rise out of his now exposed chest cavity. But before that, all these little bug creatures are falling out, like being vomited out, and then this mother creature comes out and is going, whatever she was trying to say to them. And Picard and Riker obviously look disgusted by it, and so they decide to kill that creature, phaser that out. So the scene ends with a shot of Remick's dead body. You've got the head is completely blown off. You see a little bit of the top of the spinal column. Then you've got a dissolved abdomen with dead bugs on the floor coming out of it. And then the body's sitting there just prim and proper, like no big deal. And then it's just on to the Enterprise. But without a doubt, that's got to be the most disgusting, nastiest moment in all of Star Trek. I mean, just nasty. I mean, even doing the research for this episode and getting pictures together and everything from Trek Core, and I was like, you have got to be kidding me. I mean, it was making my stomach turn just looking at the photos. Even knowing it wasn't real, it was still just like, ugh, ugh. But anyway, those are, for me, the 10 most freakish and grotesque episodes in the Star Trek franchise. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are. Please let me know in the comments section. Do you agree with my list? Are there any episodes that I missed? Do you, what are your thoughts on anything that's been grotesque or freakish in the Star Trek fandom, in the continuity? Please feel free to comment down below. You can follow the show on YouTube. Obviously, just go to youtube.com and put in Pittsburgh's Trek Chat in the search engine. It'll take you directly to my channel. You can also follow the show on facebook.com/Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. You can also follow the show on Twitter at PGH Trek Chat. I'm looking forward to the next episode. Happy Halloween to everybody, and until then, may yins live long and prosper. Hey fellow Trek Chatters, thank you for staying past the end credits of this episode. Now I want to talk to you briefly about the one Star Trek movie that was probably the most grotesque out of all, how many are there now, 13 Star Trek movies? Obviously that has to go to Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, for several different reasons. So the first one, obviously, the gross part is the SETI eel. Alright, so we're on SETI Alpha 5 with Khan and his followers. Captain Terrell, Chekhov are there. Obviously, Khan is going to put these creatures inside their bodies so that he can control them. And it's pretty graphic the way they show it. Now, just a little side note. When the first time I ever watched Star Trek II as a kid, I watched the ABC TV broadcast version. So they minimized the grotesqueness. All they did was show the bug crawling up the cheek, but they skipped the part where it was going in and just watched them scream. So when I first watched the actual theatrical version on VHS back in the day, and I saw the SETI eel actually burrowing its way down their ear canals, I was like, whoa, that's disgusting. You know, I wasn't expecting that. You know, so it was pretty graphic for 1982. You know, and then obviously on the reverse, when they're on Regula later on in the movie, and Chekhov goes nuts because the eel's going crazy in his brain. This is after Terrell killed himself. And we see, originally in the ABC TV version, they just showed a little blood droplet coming out of his ear, which was obviously the SETI eel. But we didn't get to see the zoomed up version. So when the theatrical version, they zoom into Chekhov's ear, and you see the SETI eel coming out, engorged in Chekhov's brain blood, basically, coming out of his ear. That was pretty gross and disgusting. So that's a big moment. A number two moment of grotesqueness in Star Trek II would be, well, you've got also all these dead bodies on Regula 1 when the crew comes to see what's going on Regula 1. You've got a body hanging, bleeding upside down. And then they bring the bodies down onto the floor, and you can see blood splattered on the floor. I mean, that's pretty gross and disgusting too, you know. Another grotesque moment from Star Trek II is when you see Scotty after the first battle with Khan, and he's holding on to his bloody nephew. And then you see him shortly after in sickbay, and he's got a big facial burn, and then he accidentally gets blood on Kirk's uniform. That's pretty gross and disturbing too. If you're a kid that went to go see that, I can imagine that was pretty disturbing. It's not the most grotesque moment in the movie, but it's still one of those moments that kind of can turn your stomach a little bit, you know what I mean? And then the other moment that I think is pretty freakish and grotesque is in the Battle of the Mutara Nebula, the final battle where the Enterprise finally cripples the Reliant. As the Reliant is being crippled, you see this big explosion on the bridge by the navigation console. And obviously Khan was caught in the middle of the explosion when it happened. And when you see them back on the Reliant, you see Khan kind of shaking his hand coming up, and his head is down, and then he peeks up, and you can see he's got a big burn all over the right side of his face, going into his scalp up here, and his chest was burned, okay? Like you can actually see the skin looks like it's melted. And his hand is, the one that without the glove, is gnarled and curled, and his hand is like this. So, I mean, the makeup effects that they did for him was wonderful. I mean, they showed the bloodiness of the burn, how severe it can be, you know, the melting of the skin, just grotesque. You know, and then at one point when, there's the part where Sulu says, "We're not going to make it, are we?" David shakes his head, and then they show the Reliant on the Enterprise view screen, and then Khan's kind of laughing, and his eyeballs are kind of up like this, and then he goes into that, now you can't get away, you know, that little speech, just his eyes rolling and the smile on his face, and he's looking up at the view screen with all that blood on his face and smiling. Now you can't get away, you know, it's just very dark, and it's very emotional at that moment. And they made it very grotesque looking, which I'm glad they did, because that made more tension in the scene. If he would have just looked the way he did and was just kind of crippled, it wouldn't have had the same effect. So that's the one Star Trek movie that I think has the most grotesque moments in it. I mean, some honorable mentions would be the Klingon blood floating around in Star Trek VI, you know, Colonel West, who was disguised as a Klingon at the time, breaking out through the window, hitting his head off the floor down there, and the blood's coming out. That could be kind of grotesque. I guess you could also say in Insurrection when Ruotho is getting his flesh stretched the very first time we see him, and you can hear the wetness of the flesh being connected. That's kind of gross. In Star Trek Nemesis, you obviously have when Shinzon gets impaled with the beam by Picard, and he grabs the beam and he's sliding himself through it, and you can hear it like his guts and that's sliding along the beam. That's gross too, but those are more honorable mentions. Star Trek 2 definitely gets the best grotesque moments. So again, thank you very much for watching the episode. I will see you shortly. Take care.